Welcome, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the 706 podcast, where I, along with my co-hosts, collectively decide which 706 movies are the greatest ever made. This week, we're discussing a film that I nominated and Anthony so graciously chose, titled Sideways, a 2004 film starring Paul Giamatti, Thomas Hayden Church, Ava Madsen, I believe, and Sandra Oh. It's about a 40-something divorcee who goes on a kind of bachelor road trip with his soon-to-be married friend, and chaos ensues. Kind of a dark comedy with some different elements in there, an eclectic kind of composition, if you will. And it takes place in California, too. I think location is important in this film, but before I get more into my thoughts and my logic for nominating it, let's go with, so I know Tony seems like a little indifferent. Like I remember when I first nominated, this is a second chancer. We don't get too many second chancers in the 706. We might get a third chancer if Mishima ever gets nominated again. But for now, Tony, when he shot it down, he's a little indifferent. He said, I kind of liked it. It was fine. It didn't really spark joy, as one interior designer might say. But Anthony seemed to have some level of disdain, at least, or he was mildly perturbed by the whole scenario upon giving it consideration last week or last episode. So we'll save his thoughts as well upon a second viewing. But I wanted to go with Connor because I know Connor hasn't seen this film before. So I think it'd be great to get a fresh perspective, kind of like open the time capsule and pull Connor out. He's coming out of the theater in 2004. He's got his flip phone. He's got his I support George
Game Boy Advance SP, no doubt.
Yeah, Game Boy Advance SP. He's got the I support the troops yard sign, and George W. Bush, because those are tied together, of course. And he's also a big fan of Fear Factor. So Connor, let's hear what you have to say. Really actually interested to hear your take, and we'll go from there.
Kirk, thank you. Yeah, as you said, I think interesting that I have no previous, baggage with this movie. I've never seen it before. This is a completely new exposure to me. I'm not even familiar with the director's work very much. I've heard about Downsizing. I don't really know his work very much. So this is I'm grateful to be able to experience some of this film and the context of his oeuvre and all that. I would say, as I first came into it, I was a little bit like, am I going to like this? Because of the kind of trappings of the movie that felt rather lackluster. The performances themselves are good, very strong performances with lots of personality from our two leads, Paul Giamatti and Thomas Hayden Church. But, I thought there was something a bit superficial maybe about the performances. The music is a bit trite and somehow kind of cliche to me. The scenery and the kind of the general sort of setting of these kind of sort of effete, Hollywood adjacent, LA adjacent, sort of figures was kind of, I was sort of, am I going to like this movie? But as it went on, right, and as it began to explore certain kinds of psychological depths, as it explored what I felt were very real sort of patterns and cycles of thought and behavior, I found it was very effective. And it affected me, made me think about my own life. It made me reflect on how I resembled certainly one of the two characters. And so I think it succeeded in showing, I think, with these two portraits of these two men, I think what are all too common and still very common, right, sort of patterns of behavior, and I think it's valuable in that respect as a kind of human document. And I stand by, what I would have said as far as my initial impression goes. I think there's something a bit lacking, kind of in the presentation, and just as we discussed with Letter to Three Wives, I think I could get where you guys were coming from. What is that thing that's missing? And I guess it's a certain grandeur, and that grandeur might be a certain kind of obfuscation. It might be a certain kind of, adding more mystery to it, or adding more, sort of distance, and adding more, strange scenes of, Paul Giamatti, like looking at a goat in the fields or something. I don't know what's missing, as it was, this movie was very straightforward in its presentation. And so I'm calling into question that idea of that grandeur or whatever that is. But I do feel that there's something lacking. And I guess I could say that these two characters, I guess if I could pick one thing, aside from some of the presentation, like no aspect of this movie's filmmaking really calls attention to itself, but maybe in a good way, maybe in a bad way. But if I could say anything, it would be to say that the two main characters are kind of themselves kind of flat and maybe monotonous, like sure, we see different aspects of them, but, do they quite have the depth? They're kind of both sort of caricatures of their respective types. I don't think there's necessarily a bad thing in a movie, but it didn't feel right for this movie, which I think prides itself on realism. And I think in the case of, some of the other characters, we get, well, maybe a more nuanced portrait, although we don't get to know any character really aside from the main two to the extent that we could say that they're nuanced. But anyway, so these are my initial thoughts. I think as far as writing goes and concept and the interweaving of kind of plot and theme, it's a really great example of I think a really well done film. It's missing a certain je ne sais quoi. Maybe we can discuss that as the others weigh in, but overall positive with a certain feeling of lack. But I have to admire it for its ability to nail a certain kind of psychological dynamic that I think is very relevant, especially today.
Okay. And I don't know if you want to get into that now, or maybe we can circle back after opinions. I'd like to hear you kind of expound upon that. So let's go to Tony. Yeah, let's go to Tony. I forgot to mention director Alexander Payne, I believe his name is.
Yeah.
Also directed Nebraska, which was a film about maybe 5 years ago, a very good one as well. Kind of similar thematic efforts, grounded in realism, but with a flair for the kind of, I don't know what you would call like these scenes that are steeped in irony and humorous and awkward and tragic. But anyways, Tony, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, I'd say he makes comedies, but the emphasis is on the drama, the emphasis on the characters. I guess dramedy is the word we'd use, right? Because they're kind of lighthearted in tone. They're definitely humorous, but they're very rarely like laugh out loud funny. And the emphasis is definitely on like the characters. Nebraska is a good example. He also did Election, which is probably, I don't know if it's his most famous movie, but it's one of his more iconic, influential movies. That one's more broadly comedic and kind of satirical. This movie isn't particularly satirical, even though there are certainly effective comedic beats in it. So this movie came out in 2004, right? 2004 is basically when I started getting really into movies, and I didn't see this at the time because I wasn't allowed to watch R-rated movies, but I was aware of it, and I would always read Roger Ebert's reviews. So that 2004 was like the first movie I was aware of, like the Oscars and like movies coming out and like the different movies. And I think I saw Finding Neverland in the theater. My favorite movie of all time for a little while was Ray, because that came out that year and I watched it. So I think like it's funny because I watched this movie and there's a part of my brain that's like, wow, this is like a real grown-up movie, because I can picture like that visual aesthetic of 2004. This movie's aesthetic presentation just screams 2004, and it takes you back to like being a kid and like seeing the commercials on TV or something like, wow, that looks like a serious and adult movie. Like that's still kind of how it feels to me. There's a part of me that feels like this is what like grown-up movies are supposed to be like, for some reason, some imprint on my brain. I agree with a good amount of what Connor said, actually. I think the writing and performances in this movie are very strong. I do think he sells the characters a little bit short. I do think they are fairly deep. I do think they are fairly interesting. Obviously, I love Paul Giamatti in this role. This to me is kind of the quintessential Paul Giamatti schlub, the failed writer, middle-aged, pot-bellied, balding, resentful. This kind of feels like the role he was kind of born to play. And this is when I think of Paul Giamatti, I think of this character, which I'm sure Paul Giamatti's not like that in real life, but you mean the character he tends to play and things, and Thomas Hayden Church as well. I think that his character if anything, is more interesting. And while I find Paul Giamatti's character a bit more relatable personally, Thomas Hayden Church, I think, is also, there's something very complicated and kind of sad about him. What I do like about this movie from a thematic perspective and from a writing perspective is I do think it is an kind of an interrogation, an examination of masculinity, which is certainly a theme we've turned to many times over the course of this podcast and the movies we've selected. But it's almost like this movie is like a feature-length treatise on the Virgin and the Chad meme before it came out. Because you see these two guys, and on one level, the movie presents, it's kind of told from Paul Giamatti's perspective, of course. He's the kind of the character we follow. He's the one with the main, they both have emotional arcs, but he's the one that we're kind of, I think, made to identify with a bit more over the course of the film, the one who's a bit more empathetic, a bit more, there's a bit more pathos around his character. And we really just want him to succeed, whereas Thomas Hayden Church is kind of a dick. But I think the movie frames it early on almost as like, with Thomas Hayden Church is like the big brother almost, and sort of like if he could just get Paul Giamatti to kind of come out of his shell and stop being so negative. And the thing I like about it is that it's complicated because Thomas Hayden Church is right about a lot of stuff, and he kind of has a point that Paul Giamatti should just kind of like learn to live his life and let loose and let go and just be able to have fun and stop being so negative. And there are scenes where I'm kind of like on Thomas Hayden Church's side, and I want to see him, urge Paul Giamatti in that direction. But of course, Thomas Hayden Church's character is kind of an awful guy. He's kind of a monster. He's cheating on his fiance with like multiple women. And like, I feel like it gives both characters their due. It feels complex because Paul Giamatti's character is kind of not a person you'd really want to be. He does kind of get in his own way, but in a very realistic way, just as Thomas Hayden Church, when he gets in his own way, it feels very human. And I relate to this movie powerfully because I relate to Paul Giamatti's character. I've known people like the Thomas Hayden Church character, and I can see bits of myself in both of them. And I think they are skillfully drawn and brilliantly performed characters. I will say, as Connor kind of alluded to, in terms of the direction, the aesthetic presentation, the tone, yeah, there is something about it that is a little bit flat. I wouldn't go as far as to say is that the direction is completely devoid of personality. I do think the movie successfully maintains a tone of kind of lighthearted fun, and it sustains it pretty consistently and in a pretty disciplined way. I think the music even contributes to that. It's kind of a jazzy score at parts. It's also kind of like lighthearted. It honestly sounds like the score to like a USA show or something. That sounds very negative, but I think that that's kind of the vibe we're getting here, which, your mileage may vary. There are times I find it a little bit annoying, but then there are times when I'm like, I'm kind of on the movie's wavelength. I kind of feel like what it wants me to feel in this moment. You'll have, of course, the montage of them trying different wineries, and you've got like the split screen and the way it's edited kind of in kind of a cool way that kind of calls attention to himself. You have the scene where Paul Giamatti breaks into the house to steal the wallet, and you get that shot where it just zooms in on the wallet. So, I mean, there are little touches of personality and fun. And I think that Alexander Payne has some good comedic instincts in certain scenes, even if at times it is a little too broad, because this movie, I think, as Connor said, is trying to kind of go for like a realistic tone in terms of its characters and the way they talk and the way the struggles they deal with and how they deal with them, is aspiring to realism. But then you have these moments of extremely over the top broad comedy, like when the naked guy is chasing Paul Giamatti out of the house. And that's where the movie starts to lose me a little bit. So I would say I'm kind of where Connor is, where I think this movie does have something to give us. It has some thematic insights, and I think there is more to it than there appears at first glance. But I do almost wish that this script had been given a different director or someone to kind of, I don't know, jazz it up a little bit, maybe try something different, and maybe have some of these broad comedic elements just dialed back a little bit.
Okay, thank you, Tony. He's got his wine. He's got his Merlot. He's a Merlot drinker.
We should say what we're drinking real quick. I have a 2019 Decoy Pinot Noir.
Anthony's got the Modelo. Connor, he's got the
Got the
what are those
Oberon.
called? What is that?
The Oberon. Bells.
Oberon. All right. I've got a 1918 Star Diner Case Reserve, handpicked in the Maumee Valley. Anyways, we'll go on to our final member here, our final piece of the puzzle, who is Anthony. I'll be honest, as I always am on this podcast, I'm a little nervous. I feel like Anthony could emotionally eviscerate me at this point in time, but we will see how benevolent he is. Anyways, go ahead, Anthony.
Sure. So I picked this movie in the spirit. I had forgotten you had nominated before, but I picked the movie in the spirit of giving something another shot. I had seen it in, I guess, my late teens and remember really disliking it, like vehemently, like disliking it for whatever reason that I can't call back now. But I think it's interesting hearing Connor and Tony speak because I sort of agree with their criticisms, though I almost want to take some of their points a step further than they have. And I'll get to that in a second. But before that, this is a kind of curious movie to me because if we were to go back to our 50th anniversary like special and I were to have had this movie in the list of Kirk movies, I don't know if I necessarily would jump and assume, other than the landscapes and the long roads and street signs and highway and freeway signs, if I would think of this as a Kirk movie, which is kind of getting me excited to hear what resonates with you so much later, Kirk. But as for me, I guess let's start with, there are two moments I absolutely love. One of them is the one that lost Tony, actually, which is the one where the naked man chases him into the car. And it's a scene that follows shortly after when they're trying to kind of stage the injury. And the car just keeps going past the tree and goes like heading towards the gate. And then we kind of cut away. Both those moments don't feel like they're part of this movie, I think, in that, at least the way Tony was kind of coming towards. And I sort of agree. But what's funny to me is it's the strangeness. It's a sort of undercurrent to the realism in the movie that I want throughout the whole thing. And I never quite get it until those moments. And it comes so late. I just feel like it doesn't fit. And yet it's, to me, the most humorous moments of the film. But then there's another moment. It's about halfway through, just at like the halfway point when Miles is talking to Maya and they're talking about why they like wine so much. And it's a moment where they turn wine into like the most metaphoric item for both their lives. And they begin to talk. And there's a moment there that just loses me completely. I don't know at what stage I hear the metaphor just fall apart in like my own head. But I just can't get behind it. I feel so disconnected from the moment in a way that just almost is...
but it gets good as fuck or whatever. Like that line.
Yes, yeah.
I love that line.
Needs to be tendered perfectly and carefully. But there's something about that. It just feels so disingenuous to me in the sense of, it reminds me of the way we criticize iOrigins. Moments of just male fantasy coming true for a particular type of person. Maybe that's just me and my cynical self, but I think overall, like I agree with everyone. The performances are fine. I don't know if I agree with Tony that there's a depth there. I actually, in this rewatch, I thought it was more shallow than I would have otherwise appeared. And I think there's a curious thing about wanting them to fail completely, which is like, I don't want to see Jack obviously succeed in his kind of affair, because to me, he doesn't come across as a person I'm that interested with. Whereas Miles is too much of a schlub. He belongs in sort of a role, I imagine. And because I'm not a Paul Giamatti guy, I feel like this is a role that belongs to that one actor Tony really likes from the PTA movies. So to me, like very John C. Reilly-esque type character here. And I don't really care about Paul Giamatti's portrayal at times, honestly. I kind of falls flat for me. I don't know if it's because I'm just thinking of Big Fat Liar here, and I just keep waiting for Freaking Muniz to come out. But overall, I'm glad I rewatched this. I think it's much better than I thought. I think it's a fine movie. I think there are just issues that are particular to each of us, as evidence from our unique sort of criticisms of the movie.
Fair. What did you say about Thomas Hayden Church's character? Just I want to make sure I heard.
I was saying, well, to me, I don't find him particularly compelling in a sense. I find him only compelling through Paul Giamatti's character's eyes. But okay. I think as a viewer, for me personally, I'm waiting for him to fail that whole time. I'm waiting for the scene to kind of come when the woman, Sandra's character, knows he's supposed to be married or whatever. And to me, it just comes so late. I feel like overall, and I hate this criticism of anything, the movie just feels really long to me. And it's only 2 hours, but it just drags at times. And I just want to almost push it forward. I want to pull a Slavoj Žižek and just fast forward to the kind of dramatic moments. But I tried my best, Kirk. I watched it from start to finish. Don't worry.
Oh, man. All right. Well, thank you for your input, all three of you. I would say I'm not fully discouraged. I think there were some positives all around. I think if press, all three of you would say this is an above average film. I think that would be fair to say. You can see kind of the talent on display in certain aspects, I would say. For me, it's hard to kind of encapsulate why I enjoy this movie so much. I guess I would say I have a lot of fond memories of, one fond memory of a trip I took to California in 2006, I believe, with my father's touring colleges. And we went from, the Bay Area down to LA. So on the 101 passed through, Buellton and Soldang. I made sure to, stop and get a picture of the Windmill Inn. And, these are all real places. And I think it's cool when, at least for me, when you can see a film that you can kind of chart in your head. And, I also especially appreciate films that show like a parallel to the LA kind of ostentatious, extravagant, cutthroat lifestyle, in the same region, right? It's almost like you see the human side of California or something along those lines. Kind of like watching The Sopranos, right? Where it's this distinct kind of contrast to Manhattan or to Park Avenue or whatever. So I think there is something there that resonates with me. San Diego being like a purgatory, and the wine country being more connected, more holistic, less dissociative. And anyways, yeah, I to say I identify with Miles is an understatement. I think often about this film, and just it's moving to me. I don't know if there's something in my brain chemistry, maybe it's age. I don't feel the edge that you guys are yearning for. I don't feel that missing. I don't need a Willy Wonka tunnel scene in the middle to satiate my need for irony and, I don't know, new wave filmmaking or something. But maybe I'm a simple man. Maybe maybe I like simple things. Maybe I'm a nostalgic person, right? I do think these characters, well, I think Miles is well written. It's based on a novel too, by the way, which, you can kind of see that there's more there perhaps. But yeah, I think Miles is a very relatable character. I mean, he's very depressed, but he's like a depressed, narcissistic, functioning alcoholic in a way. And that's, I don't know, that's kind of endearing, because it's so sad. And this movie is, there's a lot of sadness in it. And there's subtle things like the fact that he's such a good conversationalist in non-threatening situations, right? Like when he was talking to Sandra Oh's mother, right? She said, it was so lovely talking to you, right? Like, we know people like that who are really good at talking to moms, right? Not so good at talking to girls. Do you know what I mean? Like, they can yuck it up in a non-threatening situation. And, I relate to that, especially in my formative years. It seems like he's gone through some trauma, which is inferred through his novel. He's at a distance with his family, and he's divorced. He's, I think one of the biggest surprises was that we learned that he actually had an affair. You would think, based on kind of the archetypal image that we're presented with, that he would have been cheated on, right? But actually, no, he cheated on Victoria, his wife. I think there are some nice, fun literary references, cinematic references, the kind of the rope relay, that's kind of a funny one, and Confederacy of Dunces, all that stuff. It's a smart film in a way, but yeah, just to me, I think the general kind of sentiment that I withdraw from this film, or that I accept from this film, is the idea of days blending into each other, kind of missing something, almost like you guys are talking about the movie, but you're talking in more of a meta-narrative perspective or a cinematic perspective. I'm actually talking in the sense of looking at his character, like his character's missing something, right? He says, I've gone 40 years, I've lived half my life and I have nothing to show for it. And each day is about, playing golf or proofreading papers in the hotel hot tub, or going to a Chinese restaurant at 2:30 p.m. when it's completely empty. Like, these scenes, for some reason, they resonate with me because they feel very real. They feel like moments that can happen to any of us. I think the beauty in film and art is to see the ordinary in a way that's symbolic and also affecting. And I think this movie does that quite well for me personally. But, let's talk a little bit about, Connor, what you were saying. You were saying there's a je ne sais quoi. There's something, it's devoid of something. Is that more thematic? Is that technical? Is that with the script? Or and also I would say one thing before you jump in. I think the score is a little subversive. Like, I think it's like meant to feel like you're at a Panera Bread, but something's wrong. You know what I mean? Like, you're at a Panera Bread, but you also have to take a shit. Like, that's what in my head is like, it makes sense. Like,
I'm hoping that that's what Alexander Payne told. I don't know the composer, but said like, just you ever been to Panera Bread, but you're left to take a shit? Just something that feels like that.
Yeah, exactly. And you're in the bathroom, and then you realize there's no toilet paper. Like that. That's the ethos. That's what we're going for. Anyways, Connor, I guess we can kind of get into a broader conversation about, have indie movies have these kind of adjacent films, like blockbuster adjacent films, have they developed in a certain way in the last decade and a half? Have we seen more of a willingness to kind of break down traditional cinematic norms and, almost go beyond and explore and interrogate the cliche? But Connor, go wherever you want to with that. I mean, if you want to kind of, pontificate about a certain thing, feel free. But let's keep going.
Kirk, you're pointing me in so many different directions right now with things you're saying in a good way. To your actual question, which is about indie cinema and stuff and formal experimentation, this movie is fairly straight formally. Tony pointed out, some of the risks it takes. It has the kind of split screen section, which is kind of a post Tarantino, kind of moment, but that, didn't really feel particularly meaningful to me in the moment anyway. But I would agree. Maybe I think, what has become for me kind of a hallmark of like indie cinema is that formal experimentation and a little bit of pizzazz and sass and sort of middle finger to the establishment. I mean, now at this point it's played out. I don't think you can truly appeal to it. But think about what was a classic indie movie of this time period, like Napoleon Dynamite, for example. Compare this to that, and I think maybe you got a sense of how the climate shifted away from just simply telling, simple but effective, modern day stories, the kind of the novelistic impulse, which is to portray, modern life in a sort of clarified, aesthetically, effective form, right?
1 second, Connor. Let me just read some films from 2014, some indie picks. So we got Eternal Sunshine, we got Garden State, we've got Before Sunset, Life Aquatic with Steve Zissou, The Machinist, some other ones. But so that's what we're working with, right? Like, it's pretty
so
accurate.
Many of those I would have thought were later, actually, Kirk. But I mean, you proved me wrong. I mean, I think, yeah, you obviously had all of those movies are quite odd in their presentation and quite quirky. And, so it goes to show that already in the early 2000s, that stuff was going on. And I think that goes back to the 90s, the post Tarantino, kind of world and other influences, I'm sure. But there's so much more to the substance of what you're asking, Kirk, and I'm afraid I could go on forever. What is missing? What is missing in this movie? Your metaphor, music at a Panera, but you have to take a shit. That's the example of like the kind of art, that I search for. That kind of odd thing I never would have known I kind of needed, a metaphor that I never could have thought could have described life so well. Right, that is the kind of thing I look for, in like the great art, any of it, the old stuff, the new stuff. It's those kinds of things. Sometimes you have to go to the past to find those weird metaphors that seem to describe life perfectly. that kind of stuff. I would say there's nothing like that in the movie. You could prove me wrong, but there's nothing quite like that in this movie. Like what you just said, for example, that's what's missing. I could say other things that are missing. I could say that the Paul Giamatti character, he's a bit of a caricature because I think he's so, up his own ass, and he's so, and I think we can chalk that up to what Tony said. Again, he pointed out the simple fact, which I probably should have paid more attention to as I was thinking about this movie, which is that it's a comedy, and he himself is kind of a type, and he's kind of being sent up in a way, this sort of liberal, wine sniffing type, that he's kind of being sent up in this way. But, it just somehow it just comes across as being just kind of very annoying, and that on top of all his other kind of bad qualities, his own kind of failures, his own kind of, there's a part of me that wants to kind of say, I've had enough of you, you're so negative, you're so, so there's part of me that wants to push him away. However, part of that problem is that, I am so much like him, I'd be pushing myself away if I really believed that. So maybe it induces a kind of aesthetically induced, self-loathing, and then maybe that itself, makes me dislike the movie more. Maybe, Kirk, what if I have to ask of art that it, conceals me from myself, and I can have a more idealized version of myself that I can critique but not dislike, or something. I don't know. These are interesting questions, but sorry, I'm rambling. Let me just say one thing that I did like, and I think it's not the kind of moment in terms of like comically speaking. We have a lot of kind of broad comedy and kind of funny gags of like, the misunderstandings between the two protagonists and all of this, and stuff that I thought was relatively trite. But here's a moment that I loved when Thomas Hayden Church has to call his wife. He's kind of in the doghouse now. His wife's been leaving him messages after his like bender, and he's had sex with another woman. With his, sorry, not wife, but fiance. He says, okay, I have to call my fiance. And he says like, hey, can you leave, Miles? Can you leave the room? And he's like, okay. And he goes out, and of course it's this extremely awkward moment of he has to then he's just face to face with his roommate or his friend's like date, who is also, right, like his, lover, his mistress, basically now. Like that extremely awkward moment of just acquiescing to that moment, which is human, but also these kind of absurd and kind of strange moments that occur in life. I thought that's an example of like, I really truly laughed at that. That was a funny moment to me because it captured something that, does happen, these odd encounters and odd moments in life. So anyway, that's basically what I would have to say. I mean, there's several different thoughts, but I don't know if anyone wants to jump in on that, or Kirk, you want to weigh on any of those things. But
yeah, let's hear from our other two co-hosts about, we don't want to remake the movie, but things they could have, that were there in the foundation, or was the foundation itself kind of shaky or derelict, Anthony? I feel like Tony feels like there were, certain tweaks that could have been made to make this a film that he would have enjoyed much more. But Anthony, I feel like in the vein of like, you were talking about wish fulfillment, right? Like this is like a male centric, this is very much the idea of men being up their own ass. Like Connor said, these women are toys to be played with on this kind of raucous journey. And that's fair. Like if you look at it with a critical lens, I think that is fair. The idea of Maya's character, it's almost like she's so intriguing to Miles because she can actually understand him, right? And that's what we kind of all want. We all want someone to realize that we're special, right? And Miles feels that he's special, but he feels thwarted, right? Because he's not. And that's where the depression comes in, and the self-loathing, like he hates himself. But, I think there is something, Connor, to be said that like, I think multiple people from different walks of life would identify with Miles. And so I think there is like more of a universal sense or sensibility that we can all relate to rather than like a specific, thing. I wouldn't look into it too much. But I do at times, I feel uncomfortable watching the film because I'm like, is this me in 10 years? Right. Like, and your mind kind of goes to those dark places. But Anthony, speak a little bit on turnoffs for you. I know you said you were rooting for them to fail, but what is Miles hoping to accomplish? It's like this relationship with Maya was not his intention to begin with. So are you hoping for him to fail with Maya? Are you hoping for him to break free from his friend, from Jack, or just maybe to jump off a bridge in Los Olivos? Like, what is your ultimate, or do you not even care enough? Right? Like, that's fair too. So.
Well, Kirk, I think after listening to you and Connor speak, there's an interesting question about Miles. Is what does he want, as you ask, within the parameters of the film? And some of it is more interesting in hindsight, or maybe on a second viewing, when you have the knowledge, like you brought up, about his possible past indicated or hinted at by that novel he's writing. And also the realization that comes nearly towards the end of the film that he had the affair that ultimately led to the dissolving of his first marriage. And so there's a question there, is what does he want? On one hand, I think he wants to be this huge success as a writer, and being a huge success essentially strokes his ego. But then there's another version of him, and I think he wants to stay being actually the sad guy, because then he could just wallow in his own ego of being the sad, unsuccessful writer. And I think when you think about what led him to that moment, there's a version of Miles that may not be the Miles that we see on the film, in the sense of how was he like with his wife, the first wife, Victoria? How was he like before that? Because everything he tells Jack not to do or to like stop is what led him to where he is now, albeit less successful on the career front maybe. But on the other hand too, like, why is he such a failure in his own eyes? He's a teacher. It's a good societal job, but he ultimately feels like he should have something more. And it's the question and want of deserving, I think, is universal. But within the mode of the character, it's something to be kind of questioning about. I don't know if, in hindsight, Miles is as much the everyman or the sad everyman as we may label him to be, as much as he is the worst possible sad man or the worst possible sad guy, in reality, if that makes sense. Like, he's a sad version of most men, who, if they take it to worse and like horrible lengths, ultimately become, which is pure ego and pure desire, even if you don't want that desire to come true, is kind of what I'm thinking now. I don't know if that made sense, but I don't want to hog all the time.
Oh, that's fair. It's Tony, about sad men, correct? I believe Tony, he's our resident filmmaker. He knows a little bit about.
I did an academic study on sad men in Bolivia in 2006. I wrote a treatise. It was roundly rejected, so I just hunkered down into resentment and hatred, and that's where I am today, which is why I didn't find this character relatable. Yeah, no, I mean, there's something very male about this character, obviously, and there's kind of a universality, I think, to that thing, I think, which may or may not be intentional, but I do think that, like, if you showed most like guys this movie, they would say that they relate to Miles, at least on some level, more than Jack. Even if they are more like Jack in reality, people would feel inclined, more empathetic to Miles, right? Even though, and I think this is a kind of a clever thing the movie does, we find out about his affair midway through the movie, so that we know that in retrospect, there really is no moral difference between these men. We can't say that, Miles is any more of a principled guy. It's like that line in, what was the Israeli movie we watched? Footnote. Where the wife says, "Oh, no, you never cheat on me. You're just a coward." Or it's like, it's not that you're like such a morally pure man. It's just that, like, you're a coward. And that's essentially what this guy is. Like, he could be like Jack. He just is so inhibited and in his own head that he can't. And any way he's morally better is entirely incidental to that. It's downstream of that. So he almost doesn't get credit for it. No, but I feel like what I respond to, and my moment that Connor was talking about, where he was like outside in the window talking to Sandra Oh, the moment I felt most powerfully, that felt very like it was like almost channeling reality, was the entire stretch of their like double date when they go out to the restaurant and then go back to Sandra Oh's house. Just sort of being the, like, feeling like the third wheel, even if you're not, and having the friend have to kind of hype you up and be like, no, it'll be fun. And like, don't pull your shit. Don't be sad. Don't be don't be in your own head, and just being really grumpy about it and kind of trying to play along and not be well. Like, that felt very, very, very real, very real. And I think those aspects of Miles' character are what is why I say that he does have depth. But what I appreciate too about both of the conduct of these characters and the fact that they're both so morally compromised, is that I think the stories like this, stories about like regular people, as in not genre stories, not horror, not sci-fi or whatever, but stories about like regular people, the ones I get into the most are the ones that let the characters just do what they're going to do without moral judgment. My favorite TV shows, two of them are 6 Feet Under and BoJack Horseman. And what those two shows do is they have characters that are very flawed, do oftentimes like kind of indefensible things. And the show doesn't really pass judgment. We just have to kind of accept that as a viewer, that in this situation, this is what this character does. And we just have to follow it, which is something that you see a lot of things aren't really willing to do. Most shows will, or movies will, feel the need to make it very clear where they stand. Be like, no, this is bad. And a good character does this and a bad character does this. And if a good character does a bad thing, they have to learn from it immediately. And that's their arc. Stuff like this to me feels more real, and I've always found it more accessible for that reason. So I do respect this movie's writing and storytelling on that level. That was my main takeaway.
It's great. You know, I can appreciate what's been said. It's really gives you a pause, I would say. And for me, you know, it's one of those things, you know, I think even, you know, a couple kind of final thoughts on this film, because, you know, I really do love it. And I think there's this level of like seeing films at a certain time in a certain place can make for like kind of a flashbulb memory. And we've all had those experiences. And I think, you know, Tony, you're saying there's some relatable elements to Miles, some moments. You mentioned specific instances, right? I think we all are Miles at any given day on a specific time, right? In a certain way. Right? Maybe once a week, or I don't know. But we all, like Anthony said, maybe we revel in kind of the sympathy, the sadness that we garner or that we try to establish. And that it might be kind of like an inextricable part of his identity, right? Like, I think there is an element where he was probably dissatisfied with his marriage on some level, or he was lacking the necessary tools to maintain the marriage in terms of intimacy, in terms of communication. So he almost sabotaged it, right? And I think that's like a very American thing, like self-sabotage, right? And at the same time, bemoaning, you know, the success of others or our plight. I don't know. There's pieces of it, you know, and just like the overall kind of vibe of being a man in America, right? Like, these are two friends who met in college. I can relate to the situation, right? Speaking with 3 former roommates in college. But it's like, they haven't been together probably for, you know, they probably saw each other. They're living in different cities. They probably saw each other like 4 or 6 months ago. They probably haven't spent like any extended time more than the evening since maybe even college or a random trip. And what's the first thing on Jack's mind? Is pussy. He wants to get laid right before his, you know, like, that's how they're going to relate in this film. Like, they could use this time constructively. Instead, it's about getting laid. Like, these are the tracks that have been laid down for us as, you know, as men growing up in America. This is how we relate to each other in between trips to the Home Depot and stops at Sonic and Red Robin. It's like, we talk about sex, we talk about sports, maybe we play some golf, and, you know, make some racist jokes, you know, like, you know what I'm saying? Like, I'm dragging out the stereotype of like the American male, right? And that in and of itself is a little sad. So I think that's another element of relatability. But so yeah, I've indulged myself enough. I think we can move on to the voting stage, which I believe is merely a formality at this point. However, I will say thank you, a preemptive thank you to everyone for watching this. You know, I think there have been films in the past that have been mistakes. Body of Lies comes to mind, you know, that were mistakes on my end in terms of nominations. I don't feel bad about this one, even though it might not have been the upper echelon of films. I feel like this film is still something that there is something there, you know, there really is something there. But if it's not good enough for our canon, I'll accept that and move on. So let's start the voting with Anthony.
All right. Final point is, yeah, I guess on the surface, the personalities of Miles and Jack are different. But the more I think about it, the more I find them the same, like, type of person. I just find their kind of attitudes to end in the same results in a sense. And that leads me to two things I just wanted to bring up that we didn't get to, which is one, when we kind of early on are introduced to Miles and we see him steal money from his mom, which is kind of a funny moment, but again, about the sadness of it, like that he has to resort to stealing money, and like we don't fully know why. Like maybe he just needs the money for the trip, maybe he's, costly divorce, I don't know. And then finally, what earns him, and I don't mean in a moral sense here, but what earns him the right to that voicemail at the end with a possible reunion with Maya? And we're left kind of ambiguous as he's knocking on the door. But I find that a moment that would belong to Jack. That is a very Jack type thing, and that he earns it by having her read his novel, which is kind of interesting to me, in a egotistical, once again, way. I'm kind of middling. I'll say a soft no. If I had gone second or third, maybe I would have felt the pull of pity, but it's the soft no.
So you're right about the voicemail at the end. I feel like we're meant to believe that his vulnerability has been laid bare in his writing, right? And somewhere Dana Schwartz is like having an aneurysm about this film, I'm sure, and so problematic, but in a sense, fuck her, because I still enjoy it. And I think, he's a shitty person, but then again, we haven't read his novel. I might rim him if he wrote something good enough, right? Like, we don't know how good it was. Also, I just wanted to say the Panera, the shitting in a Panera, that was actually Bukowski too. But let's go to Connor for the next vote.
Kirk, I have so many things to say relating to what you all have said. I mean, to the point of Thomas Hayden Church's performance, I mean, something like, "You need a kiss on your bone, dude," or something like that. Like, there's something so very Californian about that. It's so very of its time. I have to respect the performance, even if I found it a bit, flat or one note or something. I think it was very well done in terms of its regional authenticity, and I'm glad, we have a real Californian to verify that to some extent. In the movie's favor, I would say, one thing that I think it brought up was the issue of like, what about the wine? What about the fact that the wine is this theme? The fact that we have this kind of weird hobby or subculture, which feels so pretentious and silly in the mouth of Paul Giamatti's character, at least I feel at the beginning, but it becomes a means of connection, right? And also, right, Thomas Hayden Church's character himself, kind of adopts this as a kind of way of connecting to his, potential, lover, or to Sandra Oh's character. Interesting, this fact of like how we use, things and hobbies and subcultures, to connect to other people. It's always been true of me with things like, movies or video games, for example. I've always used these things as crutches to connect to other people. I guess, this movie made me actually question the fact whether I had kind of come to the conclusion lately that, well, maybe this is kind of only a pretext I use, to connect to other people. But maybe it's like, maybe this is absolutely necessary in its way, having these kind of concrete, sort of self-organized systems that you kind of employ in these moments. And anyway, there are kind of, flaws to this movie. There are things that are kind of flat. There are things that are sort of lackluster, but I think we can all agree with the moral that, a friend should let his friend, cheat on his fiance. That's the moral we can all get behind. No, of course I'm kidding. But this movie has like cutting insights, and it has, sort of things that connect so much to, my life personally in a way that I couldn't even say it applies to all people, because it feels personal for me, and I think that's quite an achievement. And notwithstanding, maybe I would say there's a certain artistic je ne sais quoi, a certain artistic ambition, a certain formal, sort of quality that could have, been better. But I think the way that it approaches these topics, the way that it approaches these characters, the way that the plot and, the sort of general proceedings of sort of theme and, and sort of how it matches so well the way that the audience can reflect on these topics. I think it's a yes for me. I think it's it's unpretentious in its way. It's pretentious in a certain way in that it's, this kind of pure drama, about the kind of modern day and about a writer and that kind of thing. But at the same time, it is sort of a kind of no frills examination of something that feels, very real. So I think I'm going to give it a yes.
All right, fair. And thank you, Connor. And you raised a good point. I am feeling a little regret that I hadn't brought up the topic of wine as this metaphor that's used obviously throughout the film. I think the idea being that it kind of cuts both ways, right? It can enable social interaction. It can also be problematic, right? It can also ruin lives. Here we go. Our third voter is pouring a Malbec or maybe a Riesling over there. So we're gonna hear.
It's a Pinot, buddy.
Oh, it's a Pinot.
It is in fact a Pinot. Yeah.
It's red though.
This one is red. Yes.
Yes.
Which has something to do with the skins, he was saying, and it kind of fades out as he's explaining. Yeah. Which is funny because the movie's just uninterested. It's almost like Alexander Payne's nodding politely to his character and then slowly which is nice. You know what? Thinking about this movie more, because this is really an edge case for me. I'm going to go yes, because I appreciate this movie. I appreciate it's like Connor said, there is a sort of lack of, it's pretentious yet unpretentious, because I think, like, to compare it to, I know you like this movie, but like Birdman, for instance, which is a drama about a modern man and ego and love and all these themes. But the movie who is kind of full of himself, right? But the movie is constantly calling attention to itself. It's constantly being as big, as bold, as loud as possible in a way that kind of makes it feel like it's getting high off its own supply. This is a movie that's not high off its own supply. This is a movie that presents these characters, lets them just act in the way they're going to act, and just kind of sits with that. And I wish we had more movies like this. I feel like there aren't a lot of movies like Sideways that come out these days. I don't know. There's something about it that I cherish, even if I didn't love every moment of it. So
thank you guys. Thank you, Connor and Tony. And it seems like we're going to start a 3-person podcast now. And Anthony's
the last 3 that got in were all Anthony's, so we had to break the streak.
I vote that we send Anthony off world. How's that? What's the corporation? I forget.
Gates of Orion or whatever. The Tannhäuser Gate.
Yeah, we send him over there. Anyways, thank you guys. Appreciate all of your consideration. Very good one. Very pleased with the results. Pleased with the conversation we had, even though I feel like we could have gone on. There's just certain moments that you can kind of talk about and relate to and have a laugh at. But we'll now enter our final stage of the evening, our final act, and that is the act of nomination and selection once again, as we head toward, I believe, our 70th episode. Big milestone there. So let's see, who went least recently? Do we remember that? I know it's not Anthony.
I think it's me.
Yeah, Tony went your name.
Yes. So I will go last. Why don't we start with Connor?
All right, let's hear it, Connor. Give me your best shot.
I was going to volunteer, in fact, Kirk. I'm going to take a page out of your book and recommend something by a director who I think it's a shame we have not yet featured on this podcast. A director who I think is truly one of the great people working in Hollywood today. I'm going to recommend what is the last in a series, not unlike Return of the King, which Kirk at one time recommended. I'm going to recommend Kill Bill, Volume 2 by Quentin Tarantino.
Hell yes.
Unusual,
Yes.
I know. Personally, I champion Volume 2 over Volume 1. I think it has the emotional climax of the story of the bride of Beatrix Kiddo. And I think it's interesting. This movie encapsulates Tarantino's kind of ethos. This is sort of Mark's transition point before he kind of went into more kind of genre stuff and also period pieces, which have been all of his more recent movies have been period pieces. This is kind of the last kind of like strictly Tarantino style, Tarantino film. And that takes place in the modern day, and it's kind of comic bookish and over the top and eclectic and takes from all these different genres. But it's very interesting because on the one hand, being kind of still very flashy and very referential and kind of postmodern, as Tarantino was originally very much praised for being, it also has kind of the most of all of Tarantino's movies. I think it has the most kind of straightforward, emotional kind of message, emotional gesture, which is, of course, that's sort of the fatal love story, right, at the center of it. And I just think it's a great movie, and I think we really should give it a shot on the podcast. It often gets passed over for Volume 1, which is more flashy and kind of postmodern in its way. But I think Volume 2 is where it's at, and I hope we can give it a shot.
All right, coming out swinging. That's a great nomination, Connor. And I don't think we did True Romance, which Tarantino wrote. Correct. He wrote the screenplay.
That's correct. Okay. Yes, and I recommended that. Sorry, but then this would be our first Tarantino directed movie.
Yes, and okay, fair enough. So I think Anthony is next. Go ahead, Anthony.
All right, that's interesting. I thought Tony was going to have me go first, as per usual, for the most recent person. So I'm tempted to switch up my movie. Because it's very similar to Connor's. So do I switch it? Sorry, I'm stalling almost, but okay. I'm going to go bold then and stick with it. I'm going to nominate a movie written by Mr. Tarantino. And it's one that that often gets kind of polarized views, but I would argue is actually a great genius film. Robert Rodriguez's From Dusk Till Dawn, in which Tarantino stars, of course, with George Clooney as two brothers on a sort of trip after they have kidnapped two people, and they end up essentially trapped by vampiric creatures. And the movies that goes off from there.
Okay. Wow. No, I haven't seen From Dusk Till Dawn. I know of it. What year? Do you know roughly? What do you guys think?
90s.
96. 96.
Okay. I just wanted to see within the trajectory of his career, like where we're talking.
It would be after he was famous.
Yeah, right.
But still early. He would have still been like hot and new.
Right.
It's just after Pulp Fiction, I think.
Before
Jackie
that's
Brown.
like the hottest he ever was.
96, yeah.
Okay. Geez, another good one. Definitely, if you said, hey, we're watching either of these two films tonight, I would not be upset. That's for sure. So Tony, you got some big shoes to fill.
I have to explain my thought process here because I had a movie in mind, and then Connor pitched Kill the Volume 2, and I'm like, oh, I should change my movie now. And then Anthony did another Tarantino adjacent movie, so I'm like, now I got to pitch this one and make it 3, so you're forced. I watched this last night, and I forgot how much I love it. Jackie Brown. Jackie Brown is in that category of movies where it's like Goodfellas or Casino for me. It's like I'm trying to think. I'm thinking of just Scorsese movies, but I'm thinking of movies that are good time or something, where I just want to put on a movie that I like and it's just like a fun ride. Jackie Brown's one of them. I was literally on HBO Max and was scrolling through and I just saw Jackie Brown. I'm like, I gotta watch that one. And it's 2.5 hours. It's not a quick movie, but it flies by, man. And it's just it's a movie that it's kind of like the hipster Tarantino choice. It's the one everyone who's too clever by half says is their favorite. And when I first saw it, I liked it, but it is a movie that every time I watch it, I get a little more out of it and I grow an increasing fondness to it because it's just after Pulp Fiction. It still has that same energy, but it's much more moderated. It's much more reined in, but it doesn't feel like a modern. It's just sort of this perfect little moment. And it's not to say it's actually my favorite, but there's something about it that I think is none of his other movies quite capture. And it's just cool. Great tunes, amazing cast. It's got the works, dialogue. Yeah.
All right. This is tough. Let's hear some rebuttals. It seems like we're heading towards a Tarantino special next episode. But the question is, which movie will differentiate itself, will set itself apart, and for what reason? So let's hear Connor with some rebuttals. And just quickly, when you go, just say if you've seen the other films, and that will help me as well.
I'm kind of moved by the outpouring of interest in Tarantino. I think it feels right somehow. It feels such a unique director, and has moved cinema forward in such an interesting way. And someone who is kind of a consumer as well as a creator, and is kind of first of a generation, and to really have this very distinct voice. And I think he's extremely important, and still obviously active. He has one more film to make. I think it's great that we're having this kind of Tarantino crisis, and Kirk has to make the decision. I don't want to have to make that decision. That's tough. I have not seen From Dusk Till Dawn, and I think it's probably very much worth seeing with his performance, which I've heard about but I've never seen. I gotta hand it to Anthony there for suggesting that. I think it's a good way of getting at this director, and also his as an actor and whatever, and also as a movie itself. I don't know that much about it even, so I'm fascinated. I would say Jackie Brown is interesting because I mentioned, for me, like Kill Bill Volume 2 is like the only time where Tarantino, I think, seemingly approaches the kind of the love story. He does also, sure, in True Romance, I think in a kind of tongue-in-cheek.
He does in Jackie Brown.
Kind of male-centered way. He also does in Jackie Brown. It's true, right? It's another, very straight and, touching love story. So I'm glad that Tony suggested Jackie Brown, because I think it's in direct competition in a way with Kill Bill Volume 2. But what I'll say about Kill Bill Volume 2 is that whereas Jackie Brown is, yes, he's very much reining himself in and restraining himself from all of this postmodern and all this postmodernity and all this quotation and all this genre stuff. In Kill Bill Volume 2, he lets all of this stuff loose, but it all comes back to that central emotional theme. And I think it's a case where the Tarantino style of pastiche and reference and that chaotic 90s style all comes together to create this unforgettable kind of emotional gut punch, that I think, while I think Inglourious Bastard might be his masterpiece, sure, I think this movie to me has the most heart, and at the same time encapsulates kind of the kinds of features that made him, so beloved of critics. And I think it's an interestingly representative movie in that way, in a way that Jackie Brown isn't. But I have to say, I'm a contrarian and a kind of hipster like anyone else, and I do love Jackie Brown as well. So I would not object to watching it again by any means.
Interesting. I've long put the Kill Bill movies in that division of his films that I don't really like. And for a long time, I've kind of disliked the series. It's been years since I've watched them. So I'd be really fascinated to know Connor's thoughts, especially on the second part. Jackie Brown, I was the annoying hipster that Tony was referring to earlier, and I used to claim it was my favorite for a while. I don't know if it still is, and in fact, I'd probably agree with Connor that Inglourious Basterds may be that film and maybe his best film, although certainly up to debate. I think From Dusk Till Dawn does something interesting. One, I think it's interesting to see just for Robert Rodriguez's own career. He's someone that comes across, of course, with that sort of Tarantino camp. It's immediately after he's done El Mariachi and Desperado. So he himself is on kind of a rise. I think it's a movie that if Tarantino himself had directed would have had a much more positive reception, even if every single shot was the same. I think his script just feels so Tarantino-esque, but I think something about Robert Rodriguez's touch does something unique and conflicting that wasn't there with True Romance that makes Dusk Till Dawn really fascinating. Not only that, but I think the movie itself, which often polarizes people, although I don't know how the internet reacts to it today, but it polarized people back then, has something there, has something gritty, has something grimy and dirty for all of us to latch on to. I don't know if Tony's seen it, but I'd be fascinated to know how you feel, Kirk. And this is a real populist film. I think it's even more populist than Tarantino gets with anything besides maybe Reservoir Dogs or even Pulp Fiction. I think this is the movie that is sort of accessible for a lot of different levels, not just the high school, but the general population. And of course, features one of the greatest scenes with Salma Hayek for you, Kirk. So there you go.
Interesting. Okay, interesting. Thank you, Anthony, for picking up the reins there in that transition. And we will now transition. But I'm curious, Tony, first off, have you seen both the other films? If not, or,
Yeah, no, I've seen these both. I'll say, I think I'll start with From Dusk Till Dawn, actually. So that one's interesting because, first of all, they both made really good pitches for their movies. Like those are really good arguments. I'd love to do episodes on any of these. I say that there are pros and cons with From Dusk Till Dawn. For one, of these three, it's easily my least favorite. It's a little campy, it's a little cheesy, and yes, it's on purpose, but like, I don't know. And I guess you could argue all Tarantino's movies are kind of campy intentionally or ironic in some way. But there's something about From Dusk Till Dawn that, and maybe this is just pure bias because it's not directed by Tarantino, it doesn't feel like it has the same heft as Jackie Brown or as Kill Bill Volume 2. I just don't think it's as good, and that's my genuine opinion. It is interesting. It's the most different of the three, but I think we've already done one written by him and directed by someone else. Let's do like an actual Tarantino movie. Let's do a pure Tarantino movie. I do love Kill Bill Volume 2. I think it's great. I think it is like, I like 1 and 2 about the same. But they feel very different, and I think that'd be a great episode to do. I guess for Jackie Brown, to me, it feels like it's like the whole package. It's like it's just like it's got just enough of the Tarantino madness, but I think the emotional core is there, the characters are there, and it's got all the things you like about it. It's got the dialogue, it's got the cool 70s vibes, it's got the references, it's got the crime plotting, the fun but high stakes crime plotting, the combination of things feeling very tense and very dangerous, but also always comedic, slightly transgressive, just like, I don't know, it just hits all those spots for me. And I do think that even like, yes, among certain circles, it's like considered the best. Amongst the general populace, it is not. It's still kind of the dark horse.
All right. Yeah, this is a rather tough one. You know, we're rounding the final corner, and I don't really feel like one's running away with it, which is unfortunate for my capacity to make a well-reasoned decision, I guess. And you all gave great arguments, I would say. You know, I'm intrigued by From Dusk Till Dawn. I liked Sin City, and Machete was good. And I didn't see Alita. I don't know how that one was, but heard some mixed thoughts. Anyways, it would be kind of cool to see that transfusion of like a Tarantino, style. And then, we have Kill Bill, which, it's like, I like the idea of Tarantino almost laid bare here without the pretense of genre or, certain conventions that he might have fallen on, historical repositioning that he obviously did in Inglourious Bastards and Django, like this historical irony or parody, I guess. And then we have Jackie Brown, which, to be honest, I've only seen pieces of, and that's just my fault. And, I was maybe under the influence when I saw pieces of this film. So I haven't given it a real, critical watch, which I'm excited to do. I know it's kind of highly regarded, and De Niro's a draw. Samuel L. Jackson's for sure a draw. Just kind of running it back through my mind. Oh, yeah, it's gotta be Jackie Brown. Though I will say, I feel like this is the pick we're meant to do, which gives me some pause. You know what I mean? So, like, I hope we're not too up our own asses in this way, but I think we'll be okay, because I think we don't have to lay it on thick and say, Jackie Brown, how has everybody not seen this masterpiece? But, I haven't seen the film myself, so maybe it is his best work. We'll see. Either way, I'm rambling now. Tony wins it. Tony gets it. Jackie Brown. What are you going to say, Tony? Are we becoming a parody of our former selves?
I don't think so. Why? Just for doing a Tarantino movie? I mean,
no, because it's like, we passed on the Pulp Fiction. We would never do Reservoir Dogs.
yeah,
We're doing Jackie Brown.
I pitched Pulp Fiction, so I don't have any responsibility for that. They know I'm the populist. No, I feel like this just fits there's, certain movies feel like they're in our wheelhouse. This definitely feels like the right kind of movie for us. I think it fits in pretty comfortably. And I think it's one we'll all, even if some of us vote no, we'll all at least enjoy it. We'll all get something out of it.
All right, fair enough. And that will be for next time, folks. So go to your local library, rent Jackie Brown on HD DVD if they still have a copy. Anthony is like that one. And we will see you next time. But first, let's have Anthony, the Californian, take us away with a distinctly New York line. Anthony, please.
I'll have what she's having.